My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to a webinar that we thought would be very appropriate to offer at this time. Because this summer, in end of July and early August, we will have obviously one of the big important parts of the non-proliferation and disarmament work and agenda, a meeting of the first meeting, the preparatory committee meeting of the 11th NPT review cycle. Also about a month ago, the VCDNP held a diplomatic workshop at Krems, where we also looked at the issues at the agenda of both the upcoming NPT PrepCom meeting, but also the working group on the strengthening the NPT review process. And we had a very good discussion and thought that we probably want to have a much broader community to be privy to some of the issues we discussed there and some of the developments after that time, and open it to a broader audience. Therefore, this is the seminar that we offering you today, including some of the speakers we had at that event at Krems. I also want to thank the Austrian Foreign Ministry for providing their support for our seminar and webinar series, specifically focused on the NPT and other key issues of the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. But usually I'm the one who moderates most of our webinars. But given the topic and focus on the NPT, I want to pass the baton of moderating the discussion today to Gauhar Mukhadjanova, who is a well-known expert on NPT, and we call her our own in-house NPT encyclopedia at the VCDNP. And without taking more time, Gauhar, I'm going to pass the microphone to you. And one more time, welcome all of our participants who joined on Zoom or on YouTube. And obviously, extend my greatest thanks to our speakers today. Gauhar, to you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for a very kind introduction, and thank you to our speakers for joining us today and all of the participants who have registered and are listening to us on Zoom as well as on YouTube. Welcome to the VCDNP seminar and webinar series. And as Elena already introduced the topic, this is very much on the agenda for not only the Vienna-based community, but all the NPT states parties, the beginning of the new NPT review cycle following a very difficult review conference last year. And so we are convening today just a little over a month before the NPT Preparatory Committee meeting, which is scheduled to take place on July 31st to August 11th in Vienna. And that meeting will be preceded by the working group on further strengthening the NPT review process, which was mandated by the decision of the 10th NPT Review Conference. And so that would take place a week before the PrepCom on 24th to 28th of July. So the new review cycle is starting again under very difficult circumstances, especially in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine and rising nuclear risks, increasing rhetoric around the possibility of use of nuclear weapons, renewed questions about the value of nuclear weapons and therefore desirability of acquiring them and related proliferation concerns. There are some topical questions about this nuclear safety and security, again, not only in the context of the current war, but more broadly. So we are beginning the cycle amidst continued disagreements among states parties on both disarmament and non-proliferation issues. There's a bit more agreement on peaceful uses, but even that area is not entirely free of its problems. And so we thought it would be good to convene a month before the PrepCom to discuss a number of these issues and some of the guiding questions we have posed to the speakers I will read later. But first, I'd like to introduce those who will be actually addressing our questions. So we have a great panel here, starting with Ambassador Adam Scheinman, who is the Special Representative of the US President for Nuclear Non-Proliferation. He's with the Department of State. We have Ambassador Benno Laggner, who is the Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Preparatory Commission of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization here in Vienna. In the past, he was also the chair of subsidiary body 1 at the 2015 NPT Review Conference, so a wealth of experience with the NPT here. Speaking of wealth of experience, we have our disarmament guru, Ms. Tonie Jaquez, who is coordinator for disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. And finally, Mr. Tom Markram, who is non-resident distinguished expert with the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, but is known to most of you as the former director of the Office of Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations and Deputy High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. And before joining the UN, he also was in the South African Foreign Service. He was also Secretary General of both the 2010 and 2015 NPT Review Conferences. So between the four of you, I do not believe there's an issue we cannot address and cannot discuss in depth. And so thank you again for sharing your time and expertise. And so here are some of the guiding questions we posed to the speakers beforehand. This is for the benefit of our audience. What are the priorities for the first preparatory committee and for the new review cycle in general? What issues are likely to dominate the discussions in August here in Vienna? And which recent developments are going to shape the debates at the start of this review cycle? What are your expectations of the outcome of the PrepCom? What is the PrepCom really supposed to do? And what is it likely to achieve? And finally, on the working group that is preceding the PrepCom, what are the priority issues that the working group should address, should consider, and how can the review process of the NPT be improved for better process and better outcomes going forward? So with that, I'm going to give the floor to our first speaker. We have asked the speakers to limit their opening remarks to about 8 to 10 minutes so that we have some time for discussion in the end. Ambassador Scheinman, please get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Gohar and Elena, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with everyone virtually and to share a panel with Benno and Tonie and Tom, really three luminaries on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its process. You could probably fill the Library of Congress with everything they know about the NPT. So this preparatory committee meeting coming up is going to take place 1 year after we concluded the last the 10th NPT Review Conference. We usually have a 1 year break between the review conference and the preparatory process. Because of COVID and a variety of other complications, we had to compress the schedule, of course. So we don't have that respectable pause that we've had in the past. And, I think in some ways the situation this summer will therefore be similar to what we experienced at the review conference last summer, and in other ways it may be quite different. The principal difference, at least in terms of political climate, is that the stakes are lower. There's no final document to negotiate and to seek consensus on. The principal similarity is that Russia's aggression against Ukraine certainly continues and continues to loom over the treaty and its process in very significant ways. And while there's no agreed final document for Russia to block, as it did last summer at the review conference, its reckless behaviors in connection with its aggression, I think, serve as a daily reminder to everyone why the world so desperately needs this treaty and needs it to succeed. The draft final document of last summer wasn't perfect. No negotiated document can be or probably ever has been, but it was a text that affirmed broad support for an international system based on rules and law, with the NPT somewhere near its center. Now, Russia seems to be operating from a different logic. not only continuing its aggression, but also irresponsibly attempting to exercise some form of nuclear coercion with its implied threats and its retreat from arms control. I think this is a dark cloud hovering over the treaty, but there are others that are gathering that we can't ignore. North Korea is now 20 years removed from withdrawal from the NPT, and it's building a nuclear arsenal with intercontinental reach and seems to have abandoned any pretense of support for denuclearization. China is engaged in an opaque expansion of its nuclear capabilities, and questions remain concerning Iran's nuclear program, its future, and intent. These are hardly minor issues, and each has the potential to upend the NPT's central contribution to international security, which is a widely accepted system of nuclear restraint. And that's restraint on further nuclear proliferation and restraint on use of nuclear weapons. And I think if ever there was a time we needed an NPT, this is it. So when we talk about priorities for a political meeting this summer, I think it's important that, before we dive in and start the cycle of familiar debates, we also take a step back and recall what our basic purpose here is, which to my mind is to recenter the NPT, its systems of restraint, which, as I say, are needed, I think, in this time of turbulence in the global environment. So coming down from the clouds to the ground level, this first preparatory meeting is about taking initial steps to set a positive and constructive agenda from now until 2026, when we meet for the next review conference, address challenges to the treaty, and take a balanced approach across all three of the treaty's pillars. No matter how difficult things may be, it would be sensible to build on the good work we did last year at the review conference, despite our inability to secure a consensus outcome document. But the draft document gives us something to work with, and I think it's essential that we continue to have these conversations and not let the momentum from last summer go to waste. One leading priority for the United States will be to continue our efforts to advance nuclear arms control and risk reduction measures. Needless to say, we were extraordinarily disappointed with Moscow's decision to suspend implementation of the New START treaty, which was totally unjustified and frankly out of step with decades of US-Soviet and then US-Russian arms control practice. As National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told the Arms Control Association a few weeks ago, we're under no illusions that achieving new arms control agreements will be easy, which is why Mr. Sullivan said we are ready to engage in bilateral arms control discussions with Russia and with China without preconditions. With both countries, we're interested in substantive engagement on ways to use arms control, whether formal or informal, to manage competition and preserve stability. We also want to work with Russia and China on concrete risk reduction efforts. Risk reduction received quite a bit of attention at the last review conference, and we want to continue those discussions heading into this cycle. This includes work in the format of the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, and Mr. Sullivan, in his speech, laid out a number of practical ideas that the group might tackle, including work on missile launch notifications, crisis communication channels, maintaining a human in the loop in any nuclear employment scenario, and so forth. So we understand and we acknowledge that efforts to reduce strategic risks are not a substitute for nuclear disarmament, but it's certainly related to nuclear disarmament. And I think everyone can and should agree that preventing an arms race and reducing risks among NPT nuclear weapon states is it's a good thing, especially when tensions are high as they are now. In addition, transparency measures, including those taken through the NPT, plays a very useful role both to reduce misunderstandings among nuclear weapon states, but also to reassure non-nuclear weapon states that our words and actions are, in fact, in alignment. The U.S. releases a great deal of information on its postures, policies, budgets, and so forth, and we're happy to continue to discuss that in the context of the review cycle, and we hope others would join us. As a further demonstration of our commitment to the treaty, we, together with the United Kingdom and France, released a working paper on principles and responsible practices for nuclear weapon states. It's a document that you can find on the UN NPT website that laid down general terms for our shared commitment to the NPT, but in particular, ways in which we think all NPT nuclear weapon states should comport themselves as nuclear possessors, and to make good on the statement of the P5 heads of state in January 2022 that nuclear wars cannot be won and must never be fought. One action in particular, which is especially urgent today and long overdue, is a fissile material cutoff treaty. And as noted in the recent G7 leader statement issued in Hiroshima, cutoff treaty must be a priority if we're to forestall a return to an era of nuclear arms racing. And as a start, we would hope that China would join with the other 5 NPT nuclear weapon states in declaring a moratorium on the production of fissile material for use in nuclear weapons. But we think the time is now to move past the stale debates of the last 20, 25 years and insist, we should all insist that the Conference on Disarmament get around to launching negotiations on this treaty. So steps such as these on arms control, risk reduction, and cutoff can, to my mind, help recenter the NPT as a force for restraint and for diplomacy. It's not a complete agenda. There are many other actions we can talk about, but these are core elements we must have if we're to return to a pathway that points us towards eventual nuclear disarmament. Now, recentering the NPT also requires that we be realistic and insist on compliance by states parties with their non-proliferation obligations, and that we deal with proliferation crises that face the treaty. We, the regime members, simply cannot afford another North Korea, a state that leaves the treaty and develops nuclear weapons. Each and every case of nuclear proliferation will make disarmament and its achievement inordinately more complex. So looking forward, our priority must be to condemn violations when they occur, insist on compliance, and raise standards wherever possible, such as by making the additional protocol to IAEA safeguards the standard for NPT verification. Recentering the NPT will also require that we work together to increase access to the benefits of peaceful uses, which are not just limited to nuclear energy, but also include advances in the use of nuclear technologies for human and animal health, water resource management, and so much more. We can start by making a qualitative change in our thinking by looking at ways to link peaceful applications to the pursuit of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is what we had in mind when we, the United States and the United Kingdom, launched a new and modest effort last year called the Sustained Dialogue for Peaceful Uses. And through it, we're trying to engage a wider group of stakeholders in some of these collaborations that use nuclear technology for the work and the projects that I've mentioned above or a moment ago relating to achievement of sustainable development. We also should continue the tried and true programs through the IAEA to make peaceful uses available to member states, including through its technical cooperation program and the Peaceful Uses Initiative, a funding vehicle that we launched back in 2010 and now has wide support, and work to draw attention to resources available through the IAEA's nuclear applications laboratories in Cybersdorf and in Monaco. Our job, as we see it, is to help states access peaceful uses of nuclear energy because this is their right under the treaty, provided it's done in a way that's safe and secure and in line with the NPT's non-proliferation requirements. Just a quick word on the working group. I know I've gone a bit long here. This summer's preparatory session is unique because we did agree to set up a working group to look at ways that the review process and the review cycle itself can be more effective and efficient and so forth. And we're looking forward to discussions in the working group because it's an opportunity to make this process work better. The United States has submitted a working paper that lays out a number of recommendations to address this. Ideas that we consider to have broad support already among states parties, and look forward to building greater support behind them. One measure is setting aside dedicated time in the formal meetings of the preparatory and review process for presentation and interactive discussion of national reports. This would be an act of transparency, but also of accountability. And it's a discussion we would very much welcome in discussion with the rest of the NPT membership. We also have quite a bit of work to do to reduce the duplication among the various committees and bodies and cluster groups. And that could be streamlined in a way that pushes us away from, sort of the style of formal debates, which are just exchanges of talking points, and instead free up time for more substantive discussions with questions and answers and so forth. We should also find a way to ensure that leadership appointments to the Preparatory Committee and the Review Conference are done as early as possible, so we have a leadership team in place and comfortable working together. Intersessional regional conferences, perhaps using UN facilities, is another way to build more proficiency among NPT states parties and make the discussions more inclusive. We think that is also important. So there are a lot of other ways to improve the review process, and as I say, I'm sure the discussions will be quite engaging and instructive, certainly for the United States. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. It's a rich menu of issues that you laid out. I'm looking forward to discussion as well. Ambassador Laggner, over to you, please.
Thank you, Gauka, and thank you also, Eleanor, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And it's great to be here with such distinguished colleagues. Now, of course, Adam has already mentioned it. You mentioned it in the beginning. We are assembling for this PrepCom against the backdrop of the continuing Russian military aggression against Ukraine, which has meant that since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the risk of nuclear weapons being used hasn't never been greater. And we are also seeing unprecedented threats to the safety and security of nuclear facilities. As has been mentioned, we've seen in the course of this invasion, irresponsible nuclear rhetoric. We have seen open threats made by several Russian representatives to use nuclear weapons. We have the nuclear sharing arrangement and the reported recent placement of nuclear weapons in Belarus as another escalating factor. And the threats, especially to Zaporizhzhia, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, but also other nuclear facilities in Ukraine have been affected by military operations. Now, the more general overarching priority that I would see is really reaffirming the validity of past commitments. That is absolutely necessary. Looking at where we are now in the context of this Russian aggression against Ukraine, it's also clear that nuclear risk reduction should be a priority issue. Negative security assurances has to be a priority issue, as well as the protection of nuclear facilities in armed conflict, building on the 7 pillars that the IAEA Director General presented already last year, and the 5 principles that he outlined at the Security Council meeting at the end of May. There are, of course, a number of other issues that are important under Pillar 1. I'm sure Tonie will talk in more detail about them, but I'll just highlight a few. The lack of tangible progress on nuclear disarmament, the concerns over the erosion of the nuclear arms control architecture, the modernization programs of nuclear weapon states, both in qualitative and in quantitative terms, the need to uphold the moratorium on nuclear testing, and reporting and transparency. But I'll come back to reporting and transparency in the context of the working group on the strengthened review process. Now, with regard to non-proliferation, a key priority is to further strengthen and consolidate the normative framework for safeguards. There are 5 NPT states parties that have still not yet concluded a comprehensive safeguards agreement. Around 50 do not have an additional protocol in force, and 22 still have a small quantities protocol based on the old original text. So there is a lot of work still to be done in terms of strengthening the normative framework. Another important issue when it comes to safeguards is to ensure that the agency can address novel nuclear technologies and that it can also meet all of its safeguards responsibilities, given growing demands, with also the increase of nuclear material and nuclear facilities. And at the same time, we have the challenge of limited resources. We can also certainly expect naval nuclear propulsion and the AUKUS initiative to be raised prominently, as we saw at the last board meeting of the Board of Governors. Another clear priority, also mentioned already by Adam, is to have clear messages with regard to the outstanding safeguards implementation issues. Iran, also including the JCPOA, DPRK, and Syria. And some of these safeguards compliance issues were also the subject of joint statements. During the last cycle, we had 3 statements on the DPRK at each of the PrepComs and 1 at the review conference. We also had a statement on Syria in the last PrepCom and at the review conference. So maybe there will again be the wish of some states parties to have some kind of collective pronouncement on these cases. In addition, and given that we are meeting in Vienna, the PrepCom should also highlight the importance of export controls. We have the bulk of the NSG's work. We have the Sanger Committee based in Vienna. And of course, nuclear security should feature prominently. We are now actually already the run-up to the next international conference on nuclear security with a ministerial segment that will take place in May 2024. One of the positive results of the last review conference was the higher profile given to peaceful users. And as Adam already mentioned, it's important to build on that momentum. So the PrepCom should underline the contribution that nuclear science and technology can make to the SDGs, welcome the various initiatives that the agency has undertaken in the last couple of years, from Zodiac to Rays of Hope to New Tech Plastics. And of course, it will be interesting to hear what has been done in the context of the sustained dialogue already mentioned by Adam since the review conference. And the PrepCom is a very good opportunity to showcase the very practical and hands-on work that is being done at the laboratories, both at headquarters in the Vienna International Center, but also especially in Seibersdorf. It is, of course, in our common interest to underline that peaceful uses have to be accompanied by the highest level of nuclear safety and security. So the PrepCom should once again underline the necessity of the normative framework in this area, but also highlight all the different activities of the agency, from developing standards, nuclear security guidelines, peer review services, as well as capacity building in this area. What expectations should we have of the PrepCom? Well, as it was already mentioned, this is not a mini review conference. It is not about negotiating an agreement, an agreed document. What this PrepCom has to do is to take some procedural decisions, hopefully settle some of the dates of upcoming PrepComs, establish an overall agenda for the review cycle, and identify key issues that should be reflected in the chair's summary and on which we can build the discussions in the further course of the review cycle. And the chair's summary should really be comprehensive. It should also address the areas where there is disagreement. It should be an honest reflection of what is said in the room. Now, let me add that the chair's summary is also an excellent opportunity to capture some of the good language and some of the ideas that were in the draft final document. There was a lot of good stuff in that document, and that shouldn't get lost. And then again, we may see, as I already mentioned, some states parties making collective statements on a number of issues. This leads me finally to a few words on the working group on the strengthened review process. The topics are laid out. We have the decision, which mentions clearly 6 areas to be discussed. I'm sure you all know them, but just for the sake of repeating them: effectiveness, efficiency, transparency, accountability, coordination, and continuity. And I would add to this a 7th issue, inclusivity. Now, some of these 6 areas outlined in the decision maybe easier to tackle if we look, for example, at continuation and at continuity. I mean, one of the key measures here would be to formalize the bureau concept that we saw emerge during the last review cycle, have a recommendation that this should be formalized. Of course, that also requires chairs of the next PrepComs and the president of the review conference to be identified early on. So maybe this is also a message to the next group in line, the East European group. It would be good to already have a clear idea who the chair would be of the next PrepCom. But there are also, of course, issues that are more difficult. Transparency and accountability. But I think this is actually probably the biggest priority area in these discussions. A key element of transparency is reporting. Now, we had in the 2010 action plan, we had a clear timeline set out for reporting by nuclear weapon states. We don't have this. We don't have really much on reporting at the moment. So we should have a concrete recommendation, at least from the working group, coming out of the working group, that we should have, at least at the third session of the PrepCom, a dedicated session for the nuclear weapon states to report on what they have done on implementing Action 5, as well as the other elements that are relevant for Article 6. Another element for enhancing accountability, and I know this is a discussion that has been difficult in the past, and I wouldn't expect it to be easy, is the issue of indicators to measure implementation. This will certainly remain a controversial issue, but it would be important to at least start a discussion on this issue to explore what could be possible in these terms. A third element to enhance accountability is monitoring the implementation of the past commitments. And here is where I see a very specific area for civil society also to assist us. If we recall, during the 2012 to 2015 review cycle, where there were several initiatives in this area, some of them supported by Switzerland. We had the reaching critical will monitoring for each of the PrepComs and the review conference, CNS monitoring of the disarmament-related actions and of the Middle East WMD-free zone. And we had the work done by Gareth Evans in his state of play reporting. One recommendation should be that we should have a specific session alongside the regular session that civil society organizations have, but a specific session in the third PrepCom to hear civil society views on the implementation of past commitments. And I think I've used up my time, so I'll leave it here and look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, and thank you for highlighting especially some of the Vienna specific issues, as well as the importance of civil society involvement in the past work a number of organizations have done on monitoring. I hope we can get back to the question of inclusivity in the context of the working group in particular in our discussion. But before that, I would like to now pass the floor to Tonie Jaquez. Tonie, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena and the Vienna Center for this timely initiative and for the opportunity to give a few views to a wider audience. I am not going to repeat what has been already said, because I agree with everything that has been said more or less by Ambassador Laggner and by Ambassador Scheinman. I think that they have given us a very accurate overview of issues and of items in the agenda to follow. But I want to emphasize some issues regarding the priorities and regarding the way that from maybe the point of view of Mexico and other non-nuclear weapon states might be the focus of attention. And you asked us to talk or to identify or identify some of the priorities for this new review cycle that we are starting. And we need to remind ourselves that the review cycle is to assess the state of implementation of the treaty. That is the purpose of the review cycle, although the review conference is the one that is going to draw recommendations, or that might be able or not to negotiate an outcome, as it has been said. But the preparatory committees are a way to start the discussion on these issues. And from my point of view, the most important priority right now is to restart the dialogue, because there is a sense that dialogue is not in place, that there is some problem in assessing how well nuclear weapon states are talking amongst themselves, if at all, and at all levels, but also the dialogue between non-nuclear weapon states and the nuclear weapon states. And I think that this is the most important issue right now, because diplomatic dialogue should be the center of our activities. It's not only because it's our job, but it is what the world needs right now. We need to establish a healthy decision-making processes, yes, for the review conference when that happens. But in the meantime, we need to establish a very healthy processes and arenas for a diplomatic dialogue. And that includes, as I said before, amongst the nuclear weapon states, but also between them and other sections of the room. And that has to do with the inclusivity that has been mentioned, because we also need to incorporate in this dialogue other actors as academia and civil society. And this is one of the challenges and the priority issues for this review cycle. So we think that we should make a profit, or you may make good use of this opportunity to start a review cycle without a gap year. So we have this new and weird scenario in which we don't have we have to jump right in the discussion, but that might be a good way to reestablish this necessary avenue to continue talking to each other and trying to understand each other's positions, but also trying to find areas of common understanding. And we have already, in the NPT context, we have already we are very lucky because we already have a roadmap to follow, which are previous agreements and commitments. And because we are talking about the implementation of a treaty, there should be no questioning about implementation of the treaty. Treaties, in our view, if they are legally binding, they should be fulfilled and they should be applied. And the NPT, in general terms, is a story of success in that regard. There are very, very few cases of non-compliance. And although I recognize, as previous speakers have said, that there are rooms for improvement and we need to strengthen the safeguard system, and we need to continue enhancing our voluntary commitments and monitoring that all parties of the treaty fulfill our commitments and obligations. But in general terms, and I don't want to minimize the effect of these few cases, in general terms, most of the parties of the NPT are fulfilling and implementing the treaty. And here comes the caveat, and here comes the priority that I want to mention for non-nuclear weapon states. The thing is that non-nuclear weapon states fulfill our obligations under the treaty, and if we don't fulfill, we are into big trouble, because we might be subject to international scrutiny and possibly sanctions of the Security Council. But the non-nuclear weapon states don't have that situation of continuous scrutiny and monitoring, and because they cannot be sent to Security Council decisions and cannot be object or subject to sanctions. There is a sense always in the room of uneven distribution of obligations and responsibilities in the implementation of the treaty. So when we talk about strengthening the review process and strengthening the implementation of the treaty, there is this subtext of an attitude of level of imbalance and some level of unfairness, because for non-nuclear weapon states, it's a given that we need to implement our obligations and commitments. And that is why in the context of the discussions in the NPT, the trend of the non-nuclear weapon states is to demand a rapid pace in the agreements and obligations, especially the ones that are so the sole responsibility of nuclear weapon states, related to the unequivocal undertaking they took into the year 2000 to eliminate nuclear weapons, and that this was the meaning of disarmament, along with the other steps, systematic steps agreed in that year to give content and meaning to Article 6 of the treaty. And also there is a demand for more transparency, for more accountability, and for a more accurate assessment of the fulfilling and the fulfilling of the obligations of the nuclear weapon states and the implementation on their part. Recently, there have been advances in that regard. We cannot disregard all the dialogue that has been very important on verification since the last review cycle, and on irreversibility, and the issues that have already been mentioned about the transparency and accountability in the shape and form of the proposals of devoting more time for analyzing the reports, which we think are very important possible startup steps for future improvement in the lack of accountability and transparency that is perceived on the part of some sectors of the room. But we also need some benchmarks and timelines, the indicators that Ambassador Laggner talked about. And I'm going to say why this is important, because in multilateral fora, it is always the case that in order to monitor progress, we need some starting point, and then we need for some comparison. And of course, everybody says that these benchmarks or timelines or deadlines or peremptory dates are artificial. Yes, they are. Yes, they are. They are completely artificial, and they are completely arbitrarily invented by the negotiators. I cannot deny that, but that is the only way that we measure progress, through reporting and through measuring ourselves with previous commitments and previous baselines of data. So assessing the implementation of the treaty has been done with more data and with more analysis of this data lately, which is a welcome development. But we need to establish at least a very, very light and flexible baseline in order to compare progress with our own expectations. We cannot continue doing this without any sort of ground basis for the analysis. And finally, I am going to mention that for the non-nuclear weapon states, it is also important to feel that the discussion takes place in the review process, and this goes to the heart of what we expect the strengthening working group to do, which is to go back to the discussion and as I said before, to dialogue in the context of the RevCon, because there are a lot of issues that have been widely discussed in the NPT in the past review cycles, but on the margins of the NPT. One of these issues is the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which in our view, the concern and the prevention of these consequences should be the basis of why all NPT pillars should work perfectly and balanced. That is one issue. And the other issue is the transparency and accountability measures and proposals that have been already mentioned. So we need to go back to a way in which the room, all the parties and all the delegations have a way to discuss all these issues inside the review process itself, not because civil society events are not useful, but the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states should have a way to make this a link, make a link of these issues into the outcome process. I will finish with that, and hoping that all the state parties, despite the very difficult environment in which we are going to meet in this review cycle, find a way to profit from this opportunity to continue working on the implementation of this treaty, because I agree that this is the kind of treaty that we need to continue upholding, and we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tonie. You brought up some very important issues, including that of the dialogue and the outcome of the review conference last year. In many ways seemed to be a result of the absence of direct negotiations between some of the key actors, and the question of how this will unfold in the new review cycle, I think, is a very, very important one. And I hear both you and Ambassador Laggner and Ambassador Scheinman bringing up accountability and reporting issues, and I think we can have a further discussion about the importance of benchmarks and indicators and how that can possibly be addressed in this review cycle. I'm very glad to turn now to Thomas Markram, who is a specialist in many of these issues. So please, the floor is yours, Tom.
Thank you, Gohar, and thank you to Elena for the invitation. Also a great honor to join my fellow speakers. One of the main priorities at the first PrepCom is to agree to the modalities that will be used throughout the entire review cycle session, and also to enable a substantive review of the operation of the treaty's implementation. And hopefully this would result in producing recommendations to the review conference. Importantly, the first PrepCom sets the scene by adopting the agenda for the review cycle and establishing what the PrepComs would actually address. The last consensus outcome was at the 2010 review conference. It is clear that there are major differences amongst the states parties. So priority must be to try and find a way back to being able to re-engage on arms control, or as Tonie pointed out, getting back to some dialogue on these issues. Without being too repetitive, issues that will likely dominate the debates at the PrepCom include concerns of AUKUS, concerns over the possible use of nuclear weapons, the continued Iranian stalemate on the Iranian nuclear issue, the safety and security of nuclear facilities in the context of armed conflict. But what can be done if key parties can't talk to each other without dropping the Ukraine war? Can we find a way to compartmentalize issues to bring us back to some kind of re-engagement or dialogue? It is unlikely at the first PrepCom and in the current climate that we will see much headway on these substantive differences, but it can manage its own processes by focusing on substantive discussions with specifically clearly defined areas where substance can be developed and built upon throughout the entire review cycle. And these are areas that have been mentioned by previous speakers, but areas like risk reduction or the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons come to mind as areas that everybody should be able to find areas to speak on and to have dialogue on. The path in managing process lies in making the strengthened review process more effective, and we have that opportunity in the working group to do exactly that. Ideally, a few important draft decisions can be recommended by the working group for adoption at the beginning of the PrepCom, with a view to improving our chances for better coordination and engagement on substance. It should also avoid the situation where PrepComs essentially contribute little towards the RevCon, and the RevCon is therefore forced to start all the discussions and the negotiations from scratch. I'd like to invite participants to look at the paper produced by CNS and VCDNP in May on further strengthening of the review process, where Gohar and I go into some reflections and also provide some detailed recommendations. I'll touch on a few of them here. A key priority for improvements on the strengthened review process would be to achieve a common understanding and an agreement on the details of how the preparatory process should work and how its results should be generated. These details need to be practical, simple, and clear. The practice of appointing chairs and promoting their coordination should be formalized, as Benno also pointed out earlier. The role of PrepCom chairs in generating results and ensuring continuity should be clarified so that work from each session can feed into the next session and therefore produce elements and form recommendations at the end of the third PrepCom. States parties should not attempt to negotiate and adopt by consensus factual summaries produced by the PrepCom chairs. They should instead agree that such summaries are the respective chair's own assessment and forward them as a chair's report to the next session. To better plan and measure progress on disarmament, as well as to build upon past commitments, states parties need to conduct a far more detailed and structured review. For review cycles, states parties should consider having a document prepared by a third party, reviewing implementation of past commitments ahead of the review conference. The idea would be to have a professionally researched and drafted monitoring and assessment report serve as a basis, a common starting point for a substantive discussion of implementation of past commitments at the review conference. Accountability underpins the strengthened review process, and this can be enhanced through improved transparency. And this calls for far more formalized reporting and also a systematic approach to reviewing and discussing national reports. I'm glad to hear basically everyone brought this up during the discussions. Each preparatory committee session should allocate time for a structured discussion on the review and implementation of the treaty and past RevCon agreements, including with respect to national reports of state parties, and particularly from the nuclear weapon states. As part of the structured discussion, the nuclear weapon states should present, jointly or individually, information about the implementation of the Article 6 obligations and also disarmament-related commitments. Nuclear weapon states should report at least twice during the review cycle. Based on these structured discussions, the chairs of the preparatory committee meetings would prepare in their personal capacities a joint report to the review conference with proposals on targets and indicators to improve the monitoring of and reporting on the implementation of Article 6 obligations and disarmament-related commitments. Each review conference should allocate time to Main Committee 1 for a structured dialogue drawing upon national reporting and the joint report from the preparatory committee chairs, with a view to strengthen the implementation of Article 6 obligations and also disarmament-related commitments. As pointed out, inclusivity and all of this would make a big difference, but I'm going to stop it there because I'm sure there'll be time for lots of questions and answers in this. It is my sincere hope that by adopting some of these ideas, it will enable states parties to better manage the preparatory process and be able to bring us closer to re-engaging and having dialogue on these substantive issues to address and also improve the implementation of the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tom, and thank you especially for presenting the recommendations from the paper. In the chat, the participants can see a link to the paper if they want to read it and get more details on that. So thank you again for all the presentations, and this is now time to turn to the questions and answers. And for our participants, please put your questions in the Q&A using the Q&A function rather than chat. And those of you who are watching us on YouTube, you can email your question to events@vctnp.org, and they will be passed to me, hopefully, so that we can address them here. And so we have a couple of questions already here online, and they sort of relate to some of the follow-up questions that I wanted to pose. The questions are addressed, I think, to Ambassador Scheinman in particular, having to do with the conversations within the nuclear weapon states process, the P5 process, and the level of interest of China in particular in your assessment in the NPT in general, and specifically the strategic risk reduction measures. So if you could maybe update us a little bit on the state of the P5 discussions and China's participation. And then related to what was brought up by both Tom, Tonie, it's the issue of direct dialogue involving US and Russia in particular. There's a question from Daryl Kimball that relates to that, which is how can the PrepCom be used to build support and pressure for the resumption of US-Russian dialogue on arms control measures post 2026, when the new START is set to expire. So I think I'll turn to Ambassador Scheinman first, and if other speakers want to chime in on these questions in particular, please let me know.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for transcribing the questions, which I'm unable to see because I'm technically challenged. But those are very important questions, and I'm happy to offer a few comments. Obviously, the fact of Russia's aggression in Ukraine and conduct, the war and Russian behavior makes it very challenging to act as if this is business as usual, and that we're somehow not operating in a world that challenges our basic assumptions about sovereignty and territorial integrity and the purposes for which we have a UN charter. So we can't pretend that those are matters that don't impact our ability to think through and talk with other countries about nuclear weapons, about their control and reducing risks. That said, we have pursued a dialogue over the course of a number of years involving the P5 or the N5, I think, as we prefer to say, the acknowledged nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Those dialogues historically have been useful for generating greater understanding and perhaps transparency among the five, even if it hasn't delivered as much as we might have hoped. And even in the current circumstances and in the current operating environment, we have tried to preserve space for discussions, at least at a experts or technical level. We've had a number of conversations now among experts looking at questions of nuclear doctrine and risk reduction. Those are continuing. We hope to have another round of discussions this summer, and we will do our best to ensure that those conversations are productive and lead toward results down the road. I can't make any promises, in part because discussions at a political level are very challenging given current circumstances, and I think everyone understands that. In terms of engagement with China, and actually this applies to Russia to a degree as well, Tom Markram mentioned the word compartmentalize. That's a word that actually appears in National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's speech earlier this month. It's very much our interest, and we see value in compartmentalizing to the degree possible arms control and risk reduction discussions from the current conditions of strategic competition in the global system. And to the degree it were up to the United States, we would have such discussions with China, and we would, eventually find our way to having discussions with Russia on a follow-on to the New START treaty in whatever form that may take. But with respect to China, the United States has been pushing for many, many years for bilateral engagement, and so far that interest hasn't been met by Beijing. We have over the years pursued a number of track 1.5 dialogues involving official and non-official participants. We've been a bit disappointed by the results of those dialogues, and given current circumstances, we think the time is right to return to a track 1 formal government-to-government discussion on strategic issues, in particular our interest, and I think it's an interest of many other states parties, to understand why China feels that it must build up its nuclear forces as it is clearly doing. What impact does that have on conditions of strategic stability? How do we understand strategic stability? How do we understand nuclear doctrine and the impact that may have on perceptions of others? There's just huge and very wide berth for possible engagement. We'd like to pursue it, and I very much hope China will view it in the same way. In terms to Daryl's question, direct dialogue on New START treaty, we are, as I said, interested in preserving the treaty that we have. That is, of course, the first priority. And unfortunately, Russia has suspended its participation in the treaty. We don't believe that was a legally available option. We hardly understand it. The United States had been trying for some time to return to mutual inspections after a pause due to COVID. But Russia, looks at this differently, obviously, and has seemed to link, the U.S. and Western support for Ukraine in its self-defense against Russian aggression as connected to future discussions on nuclear arms control and disarmament. So I think, frankly, that question really goes to Moscow and not to Washington. As Mr. Sullivan said, we're interested in pursuing discussions on follow-on steps in arms control without any precondition. Unfortunately, Russia views it differently. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may ask other speakers about where they think non-nuclear weapons states stand in terms of collectively putting pressure, not just on Russia, but also, and that's another part of Daryl Kimball's question, calling on all 5 nuclear states to commit to refraining from any further increase in their stockpiles and their arsenals. Is there potential for non-nuclear weapon states to really come together with a strong message on that at the PrepCom? Any volunteers? Yes, Tonie, please.
Yeah, I think that that question is very pertinent, but it is also a little bit unfair because that's in our view, that's what we do at the RevCon. The non-nuclear weapon states maybe don't prepare a statement of the 180 plus requesting this, but in the room and in the work that we do during the PrepComs and during the RevCons, when we say restate the validity or the currency of the past commitments and obligations, we mean that. Because if you see all the commitments in the action plan of 2010 that draw from 1995 and 2000 include the need for the United States and Russia, and also for the other nuclear weapon states to come together in and talk about their views on nuclear weapons and report back to the room. And certainly reduction is not it's contradictory with unequivocal it's not contradictory with the unequivocal undertaking to eliminate nuclear weapons, so nuclear arsenals. So when we demand the fulfillment of the 13 steps when we demand the nuclear weapon states the fulfillment of past obligations and commitments, that's what we mean. Of course, there are a lot of ways in which we should elevate not the pressure, but the political cost, because this is not an issue about pressure. Each state is sovereign, and we, as I said before, we are under the assumption that legally binding commitments should be fulfilled no matter what. But the issue is not pressure. The issue is elevating the political cost of not doing that. And that is why non-nuclear weapon states should continue elevating the voice and signaling that the pace in the fulfillment of nuclear disarmament obligations is very slow or modest, to say the least, and we should increase that pace. But the real challenge to do that is, and I'm sorry for what I'm going to say, but because I don't want to place the blame on others, but we also need to recognize that there are non-nuclear weapon states that are more and more saying that this is not the moment to reduce nuclear arsenals, or that are challenging or questioning themselves the value of nuclear weapons in their political doctrines. And that is a challenge that we need to address at this review conference. I want to finalize my comment on fulfillment of Article 6, saying that this is going to be the second review cycle in which a number of parties of the NPT have agreed on a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons that has entered into force. And we, the TPNW parties, have stated the complementarity of this treaty with the NPT with regards to our own obligations regarding Article 6 or fulfillment of Article 6. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tonie. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but oh yes, Ambassador Laggner, please.
Thank you, Gaukar. Well, I mentioned as one of the elements of one of the important elements to be addressed exactly the issue of the modernization programs, both the qualitative and the quantitative modernization. So I'm sure that this will appear in many statements of non-nuclear weapon states, but I think also Tonie made an important point. When we talk about reducing the role of nuclear weapons in doctrines and in security policy, this is also a message to be directed to the umbrella states, to the non-nuclear weapon states that have this as a key element of their security policies. So it's not just a message directed at the nuclear weapon states, it's a message directed more broadly.
Thank you. I have a sort of a related question, if I may pose, and you, Ambassador Laggner, especially brought up the deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus. That's kind of a major new development. And I wonder how that is going to influence the conversation on nuclear sharing, because that kind of flared up in a serious way at the last review conference, when there was an attempt to single out sort of the responsibility of also those countries that are under extended nuclear deterrence in advancing the nuclear disarmament. And there was pushback. And traditionally, this has been kind of an issue directed against NATO. Well, now we also have Russian nuclear weapons deployed in another state, or being deployed in another state. How is that going to change the nuclear sharing conversation, if at all?
Well, I'm also curious to see what that will do, because you're right to say that it has been a message coming from many NUM countries directed at NATO. So fairness would demand that the same message be now directed towards Russia and Belarus. And I'm also curious to see whether that will happen. We're not part of the NAM, so I don't know whether any discussions are taking place in terms of NAM statements that will be prepared for the PrepCom, but I think it'll be interesting also to see, as you said, whether this will change the nature of the discussion, or whether the topic will fall off the table altogether.
Or it might become even more urgent because the practice is spreading. Any thoughts on that? Yes, Tonie, please. Yeah, and then Ambassador Scheinman.
Yes, I don't know either whether Mexico is an observer of the NAM, but I don't know if there are going to be especially directed messages. But I just want to mention that from the point of view of some non-nuclear weapon states, NAM or not NAM, and groupings like the New Agenda Coalition, our demand has always been the reduction and the elimination of nuclear weapons, regardless of their size and location. And that includes nuclear sharing agreements. Even though there is this technical discussion at the review processes on whether nuclear sharing is or not a violation or a breach on the compliance with the treaty, there is a demand on the elimination of all nuclear weapons, and also on the issue of the review of doctrine and policies that place nuclear weapons at the center of security policies. For the vast majority of parties of the NPT, nuclear weapons are not an option. And of those parties of the NPT, many have established legal provisions to ensure that nuclear weapons are not an option in their nuclear security policies. So that is going to continue to be, upheld and emphasized during the statements at the NPT, and that is going to contrast with the ones that are changing their minds, including Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Scheinman, you had your hand up before. Do you want to come in on this one? Or?
Yeah, if I could. The discussion on nuclear sharing, on modernization, and even the question of Belarus and the impact it will have. I do think we have to take a step back and recognize that there at least is a difference of view. We have a pretty clear view on it, but a difference of view among states parties on the relationship between disarmament and security. There is a view that through nuclear disarmament, we can achieve conditions of world security for, sorry for a loose term such as that. There's another perspective, and I think it reflects U.S. understanding and practice, that without security, we simply cannot make serious progress toward the achievement of nuclear disarmament. We can take steps along the way, but getting there is hugely demanding and complex from we're seeing play out every single day on the news with respect to Russia's war in Ukraine, with respect to legal requirements for verification and enforcement. No disrespect to the supporters of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but it's not our view that that treaty is adequate to create the conditions necessary to sustain nuclear disarmament. So I think we have to recognize that there is this, at least basic difference among parties, and I hope it's one we can continue to address, and maybe address in a more serious way, certainly more serious than we have in past review cycles. So I'll look forward to getting to that. The other point I do want to make is the discussion of modernization and umbrella states, which I'm not exactly sure what that means in legal terms. I don't think it really means anything, because the NPT creates two legal categories of states: the 5 that are acknowledged to have nuclear weapons and the rest that do not. There is no state that relies on nuclear assurances from the United States that is also an NPT nuclear weapon state. But these are states that are dealing with serious proliferation and security concerns, for which nuclear assurances play a role in keeping those states non-nuclear. The temptation when we look at this question of, is it disarmament or is it security, is to bucket the 5 nuclear weapon states as one. And I think that does a disservice to our understanding of what's happening in the world and why some states rely on nuclear assurances. The nuclear modernization campaign of Russia and of China looks nothing like what the United States is pursuing. The United States is not putting making available hypersonic weapons with nuclear warheads. The United States is not moving ground-based nuclear armed missiles closer to the borders of Russia or putting them anywhere in Europe. This is not the case with Russia. So I think we have to acknowledge that the modernization programs of at least one and probably two countries has an impact on states that have a commitment and an obligation to remain non-nuclear under the NPT, and they're probably going to look for greater assurances as those threats rise. And I think certainly in the case of the North Korean nuclear program in Northeast Asia, that's created great security stresses for the Republic of Korea and for Japan. And so we have seen a natural reaction by those states to seek deeper assurances of nuclear security guarantees from the United States. So, I do hope that as we, take these discussions forward, we do so recognizing that we have to deal with the treaty in the world that we live in and not in some abstract universe, and that we're able to make distinctions among the P5 states. It does no service whatsoever to the NPT to bucket the five as one because of their special category under the NPT. Thank you.
Thank you. Tonie, you have something to add on this? Yeah, okay, let's do that briefly, and then we have a number of other questions that I'd like to try to cover in the time we have remaining.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, but I just need to say that there is no dichotomy or mutually exclusive concepts between security and disarmament, and the existence of nuclear weapons is also regarded as a threat to the security of the non-nuclear weapon states. So this is an issue that has also to be, even if non-nuclear weapon states are not on their nuclear security extended nuclear deterrence agreements or any military alliance or nuclear sharing, there is a sense that there is a threat to the security of our peoples. And it's good that Ambassador Scheinman brought up the issue of NSAs, because this is another issue that is going to feature prominently in the debate at the command. That's why I wanted to jump in, because the fact is non-nuclear weapon states have placed legal provisions in order to ensure our non-nuclear status, and that should not pose any risk to the security of the nuclear weapon states. So the nuclear weapon states should ensure the securities that are a legitimate concern and a legitimate claim from the non-nuclear weapon states. But we have seen that this is an issue that is not the black and white, that there are breaches in the obligations and commitments from some of the nuclear weapon states. We agree that the nuclear weapon states are not a monolithic entity. Neither are the non-nuclear weapon states, but we think that we need to pay attention to the security concerns of the whole NPT parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I like this lively discussion. Unfortunately, we are a little bit pressed for time, and so we'll step away from disarmament discussion for a minute to address the question that we get from Jackie Cabasso. About the modalities for the working group on the strength and review process. In particular, she's asking if the meetings of the working group would be open to the civil society organizations as observers. The decision adopted by the review conference says that working group needs to operate of procedure of the previous review cycle. So that means NGOs should be allowed as observers, but I understand there are disagreements among states parties right now on the exact modalities of holding the while holding the working group meeting. So we all would appreciate an update from you, as well as a comment on this situation and this issue. Who would like to update us? Yes, Ambassador Laggner, please.
Well, maybe first to comment, and the general position that Switzerland has on this issue is that this discussion should be open for the participation of NGOs, as we have in the plenary sessions at the review conference, or we have at the PrepCom. And we would also be in favor of webcasting this discussion. We have the situation that, I mean, we are dealing, one of the issues on the agenda is transparency. So we can hardly do justice to the whole discussion if we have a discussion on transparency in an intransparent setting. We also need to recognize that we have a situation where the working group is taking place at a time when delegations are maybe also not in Vienna in full strength. We have the holiday period. We have some delegations also that may not be able to send a large representation of Vienna. So also for the sake of the representatives that are at home, it's important that they can follow this discussion. So Switzerland fully supports the idea of having a discussion that is open, and also in favor of having it webcasted. Now, where we are at the moment is that exactly this issue of the modalities is still under discussion because there has been no consensus. There are some who have said that these meetings should not be open. And they've also taken the rules of procedure. They are comparing this to meetings of subsidiary bodies and say the working group should be treated like a subsidiary body. And as we know from the review conferences, in the subsidiary bodies, these meetings are closed. Whereas our view is this is like a plenary meeting and therefore should be open to NGOs. I mean, just to point, we would also be in favor of having the subsidiary bodies at the review conference open to the NGOs being in the room. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to come in on this, having dealt with the processes in all kinds of fora?
I mean, I agree with Benno entirely. I mean, all meetings are open unless decided otherwise. So a conscious decision has to be made to close a meeting. And unfortunately, in the case of subsidiary bodies at RevCons, there has been the tradition to close them. It doesn't mean that they have to remain closed forever. Each RevCon and each PrepCom can decide its own modalities on stuff. It is particularly frustrating for someone like me, who's now a civil society member, to spend 30 years working on these issues, not even to be able to hear what happens in meetings like the strength and review process, which for all intents and purposes is very much more a bureaucratic process. Obviously, there are elements of substance in it, but it has to do more with a whole lot of other stuff. I can't see that anything is so secretive or sensitive that it can't be open for discussion. And therefore, it is difficult for me to understand the thinking behind that. It is a working group. It was decided for this particular review conference. There is no similarity that needs to be drawn between that and subsidiary bodies. There is no precedent for that either. So it is entirely up to the states to decide the modalities that they want to adopt. Obviously, the more people we can include, as Benno has pointed out, I mean, the modalities can exclude civil society from speaking and things like that, but the fact that they can't even listen to what's happening there is, for me, a tragic loss in this context. Thank you.
Thank you. Tonie, please.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just wanted to add that definitely one issue that needs to be addressed at the NPT participation of civil society, but the quality of the participation, because the practice has been that it is the same for states, as Ambassador Scheinman pointed out, we repeat the notes, unfortunately, or pre-written drafts of our statements, and that's what the way we portray our positions. But there are very limited opportunities for interaction or for really discussion of the matters. And the same goes for civil society. A segment for civil society to present their views on issues without to interact, except in the side events, has not been useful, in my view, for advancing diplomatic dialogue in the NPT context.
Thank you. Ambassador Scheinman.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to at least take the floor to note that it's certainly not the United States which has rejected agreement on including civil society and to webcast the discussions. It's a very, very small group of states representing something like 1% of the total membership, if even that could probably go below that number. But I think we do have to recognize that it's states parties that assume obligations under the NPT, and the delegations that come to the meetings are, of course, accountable to their national governments. It's a bit different for civil society, but we very much believe that there is value in including civil society in NPT discussions, and we very much hope there's a path forward here. It's really in the hands of our PrepCom designate chair, Ambassador Vienna from Finland, to try to work out some suitable arrangement or compromise with the objectors. Thanks.
Thank you very much. With your indulgence, I would like to extend the time of the seminar by 5 minutes, if you can stay on, because we have a number of other questions, and one that comes from Michiru Nishida. It relates to an issue that several speakers brought up, and that is the benchmarks and indicators for disarmament. We heard positions from Ambassador Laggner, from Tonie, from Markram about the importance of these. Can we get maybe a comment from Ambassador Scheinman about the possibility of this issue going forward, specifically if the US has a flexibility on discussing the question of benchmarks, and where do you also assess other nuclear weapon states stand on this?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll certainly not speak for other nuclear weapon states. I think that's for each to address the context of their own national requirements, preferences, and so forth. I think for the United States, there's the question of prior commitments, and I think Tonie covered that very well in her remarks, and Benno did as well, with respect to dealing with possible indicators and benchmarks and so forth. I think we should, as a group, perhaps as we take a step back from the brink, as it were, and have a conversation about where we are, where we have been, where we would like to be with respect to implementing some of the prior commitments. We undertook those commitments in good faith. We also undertook them in a world that is vastly different from the one we're currently operating in. In some cases, the commitments made in the past, I think, have less relevance for today. They've been overtaken by events. There are commitments to pursue treaties that never even got off the woodshop floor. But there are others that we think ought to be pursued with much more vigor among all states parties, including making progress on a fissile material cutoff treaty. So I think there's ample space for looking at where we are and where we're going with respect to those prior commitments, and we look forward to that discussion. The concern that we would have with respect to establishing new indicators relates to a challenge that Tonie mentioned in her opening remarks. It creates a sort of an artificial aspect to our discussion, because no treaty, of course, or commitment or agreement can be pursued. As I said earlier, in the abstract, it's connected to the world we live in, it's connected to the ambitions and the preferences of partners. And so I think we have to be, a bit realistic about our ability to forecast what is possible in the future. We do need to continue to identify steps that we think can be taken and should be taken to pursue implementation of the ultimate nuclear disarmament goals. But prescribing that creates a potential, I think, for disagreements that are really unnecessary in the treaty. We can set a timeline for a next iteration of the New START treaty, but it's really outside of our power to ensure that we'll ever meet that mark. It's outside of the power of the non-nuclear weapon states. It's really a question of whether we're operating in an environment where progress is possible. So my concern is that as we set requirements that are not met, we create further perils for the NPT and raise a sense that the treaty is somehow failing, which I think is unfair and frankly unfortunate. So happy to look at this issue. I know we will in the working group process and in the preparatory process as well. But I think we have to be realistic about what is possible and what is serving the NPT in the future.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of the time, so I have a hand raised by Tonie. If you could also use that to maybe make some of the concluding thoughts, and then I'll turn also to Ambassador Laggner and Tom to give them a chance to say a couple of words in conclusion. Tonie.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to highlight that we already have some deadlines that are a little bit artificial in the NPT, which is the review cycle itself. We have a mandate to every 5 years review the implementation of the treaty. So we already have a deadline every 5 years, or in these few years it has been 7 or 6, but we have that deadline. So I am not saying that deadlines are an end in themselves, but we can also set some deadlines and benchmarks as it happens in other multilateral processes to measure progress. And the outcome is not in our hands. I agree with Adam, and that goes for all the processes. Multilateralism doesn't work like that. But in fact, in other processes, we say by 2030, we're going to measure how the agenda for development is being implemented and which indicators we are closer to have reached and which others we have not reached. And we already have a deadline in the NPT. So that would be my final comment. And I thank you for this opportunity to exchange views before we meet in Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tonie. Ambassador Laggner, any concluding thoughts from you? And we have a number of questions remaining. I have to apologize to people online if we didn't get to you. And one of the questions had to do with the possibility of achieving consensus at all in the given circumstances in the multilateral fora. And so if you don't have to, but if you want to apply that question to the NPT in particular, that would be great. Please.
Well, I think the big advantage that we have with the PrepCom is that we do not need to achieve consensus on an outcome document. So we should actually use this opportunity to have a real discussion. We should clearly lay out also where the differences are. We don't have to artificially try and agree on a lowest common denominator or something. We should have a frank discussion, and this should also be reflected in the chair's summary. He has the possibility to reflect the discussion as it has been held. And that is then something we can build on for the next cycle. On consensus, maybe just one word. I've said it many times. It is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve consensus. So this is why I think we need to look at more flexible forms. We need to have outcome documents that also reflect certain differences instead of artificially trying to come to a lowest common denominator and everything. But that's a discussion maybe to be held for a next webinar before the review conference. So thank you also, and I really enjoyed being on this panel.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Tom Markram.
Just in a little bit of response to Daryl's question on leverage, I think the point that many of us were trying to make, that if we do handle the processes at this PrepCom differently, and we do come up with some topics and build in some means in which we can actually have an interactive discussion, you'll basically be putting leverage on those particular nuclear weapon states to respond to some of those questions. You could have panels, you could have briefings, you can do a number of things in any PrepCom. You can invite civil society members to come and present some stuff outside their normal sort of piece. There are a number of ways in which you can make that discussion far more, I think, interactive and pose questions to nuclear weapon states, which should draw them into dialogue and hopefully draw them more into engagement. And that way you can get the whole PrepCom to be working on those particular issues. And I think the strength and review process working group allows us to start making some headway in that direction if we can actually get our act together in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Scheinman, did you have any two concluding words, or your?
No, I've said enough.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed being on the panel.
Thank you all very much. I very much enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could continue. There were more questions. If I didn't ask them, it's again because of time, not because I thought they weren't important. I hope everybody who's watching us is sitting and uploading the speakers. I will when I turn off the computer. And with that, thank you again for joining, and good luck to you at the PrepCom 1. I'll see most of you here in Vienna, hopefully. And here's to a productive meeting in August. Thank you.